Let me take the third one, the hurricane thing. The idea that hurricanes are going to get ever costlier. We're going to see ever more hurricanes slamming ever harder into the US and causing ever more damage. It's absolutely true that we're going to see more and more damage for the US. This is the damage of hurricanes over the last 105 years for the US. What you see out there on the very side is the Katrina and the many other ones that hit in 2005, vastly outbeating the last record in 2004, which again outlasted the 1992 Hurricane Andrew. Do you remember? We worried intensely about Hurricane Andrew. Now, of course, it looks like a small bleep almost. So basically what you see is a rapidly increasing curve. This is absolutely true that we're going to see more and more damage. The point, though, is that the vast majority of this is not caused by climate change. Most people believe that, and we still don't have actual confirmation in the record, but we believe that we're going to see more violent hurricanes. We're probably not going to see more hurricanes, but more violent hurricanes in light of global warming. But this is not, by any standard, the main impact of global warming. This is due to social factors. This is due to the fact that many more people live much closer to harm's way with much more stuff. To give you a sense of proportion, over the last 100 years, the US population quadrupled. But over the last 100 years, the population of Florida increased 50-fold. It's just simply much, much nicer to live close to sea, as people here in Seattle know. And of course, we also got much richer, which means that we have much more stuff to get damaged. So some researchers, Pilkin and company, actually said, okay, well, let's try and take a look at what would happen if all hurricanes that have hit the US over the last 105 years hit the US as it looks today, with today's distribution of wealth and today's distribution of humans. And then they said, let's try and run all the hurricanes again and see how much damage we would have seen. And notice how the picture is going to change, because suddenly we get a very different picture of what's actually happening. Actually, the most damaging hurricane is the Great Miami Storm, hurricane from 1926, that tore right through downtown Miami and caused a huge amount of destruction. It actually killed 2,000 people, which were more than died in Katrina. But basically, it just ripped through a downtown of sheds. And that's not entirely true, but it gives you the impression there was not much to damage, and that was why it was so costless back in 1926. But that's because of social factors, not because hurricanes have gotten much more violent. Actually, the second largest hurricane, the second most destructive hurricane, would be the Galveston hurricane of 1900. That was the most killing hurricane in the US history, killing 18,000 people, more than 10 times as much as what Katrina did. And Katrina is only third in that ranking. The point is also, notice how Hurricane Andrew got much more expensive. If it had hit today, most estimates, the British Reinsurance Organization actually estimate that Hurricane Andrew would have been about twice as costly had it hit just 10 years later in 2002 rather than in 1992. This points out to the fact that the general issue is really one of social factors. And thus, again, we come back to saying, if we actually want to help future victims of Katrina and Andrew and all the others, are the best thing we can do to cut carbon emissions? Well, let's take a look. If we look at the models, what will happen till mid-century? We know that if we just assume that nothing changed in the social side of issues, but we only see an increase in climate change, as we're likely to see, and therefore an increase in violence of hurricanes, we're going to see an increase in the damage coming from climate change. That's the first part you see over there. It's going to increase damages by about 10% by mid-century. On the other hand, if we envision we didn't have any climate change, but we had social change, that is more and more people with more and more stuff moving closer to harm's way, as we've seen in the past, over the coming decades till mid-century, we're likely to see almost a 500% increase in the damage costs. Now, the question here again I would like us to start thinking about is to say, if you were going to help people in 2050, which of these two bars would you start adjusting first? Which one is the more important to make sure that we actually have a better situation in 2050? In climate change, we can cut a little. For instance, if we do the Kyoto Protocol, we can probably avoid about 0.5 percentage point extra come mid-century. Now, that's good, but that's not very much, right? On the other hand, very, very simple approaches could probably cut this somewhere between 50 and 80% of the increase in the damage caused between 250 and 400% point. We could cut by very simple measures. Most of us don't even have a sense of what that is because we don't have that conversation. Everybody focuses on cutting carbon emissions, but if we actually care about these victims, maybe it's about some of these other things, like for instance in Florida, we subsidize insurance, which means basically we're encouraging people to build irresponsibly. We have poor building codes. Let's get better building codes where we have better structured homes. Let's also have better enforcement of those building codes. Perhaps we should have more wetlands, for instance, in front of Louisiana, which would actually have helped Louisiana being better able to deal with, and New Orleans being better able to deal with Hurricane Katrina. And of course, also having better levees around New Orleans is an obvious point of saying, if we actually wanted to have helped New Orleans, should we have increased their levees or should we have done the Kyoto Protocol? And it's quite obvious that we should have increased their levees. Now, we should also do, and we'll get back to that, do something about climate change in the long run. But if we're going to have a sensible conversation, we need again to ask which of these two should we first change? Should we do something very hard about a slight bit of the climate change one, or should we do something that's actually fairly cheap and often will make us money about the huge social impact? Again, it's about starting to think not about just what feels good or what is the general consensus of the discussion right now, but it's about making sure that we do the things that actually will do the most good into the future. Let me just take the last one, the malaria issue.